Our next speaker is Simone Webb, and Simone studied for their undergraduate and master degree at the University of Oxford and completed their PhD at University College London. Their thesis established a dialogue between the early modern feminist philosopher Mary Astell and late Foucault, aiming at the same time to make a contribution to the current feminist discourse. They currently work at the University of Sussex as an academic advisor. Excuse me, please.
Yes, that's good. Thank you. Thank you. So I was asked to write about philosophy as a way of life and feminism, which is something I've thought about before, especially during my PhD, but not especially systematically. It had often struck me as odd that PWL scholarship hasn't really paid detailed attention to gender yet. It seems strange as how can a way of life not be inflected by gender, given the structuring effect that gender has on the entirety of our lives? And as a side point, I was yesterday during one of the sessions tallying up the numbers in the bios and noted that the kind of 22 men speaking at this conference to 6 women, which I think probably reflects the imbalance in philosophy as a whole, but I found quite staggering. My main aim in this talk is to raise questions and concerns about gender, feminism and PWL, rather than to answer them definitively. I don't think I could answer them definitively in half an hour. But the broad thrust of my argument is that, as Hadot presents it, PWL is generally inattentive to a divide that exists in gendered experiences and attitudes. So while it's overtly gender neutral, it doesn't adequately account for the value of women's experiences and perspectives. But that doesn't mean that it needs to be abandoned, obviously. I think it almost certainly holds some valuable possibilities for feminist reworking. And my focus here in the chapter is entirely on Hadot's presentation and interpretation of philosophy as a way of life. I'm not going into historical stuff or Stoicism at all, except as Hadot's presenting it himself. And although he was ostensibly undertaking historical scholarship, it seems really clear to me that he's presenting a Gehira project of his own throughout his writing, and it's that project that I'm trying to assess. So I'm kind of picking out from that project for this talk the notion of a completely transformed existence, the content of some of the spiritual exercises he identifies, the view from above or the cosmic perspective which he advocates, and how the feminist struggle against injustice might connect to PWL. I'm not committing myself here to any strong definition of feminism. My aim is to be attentive to gender in relation to PWL, particularly attentive to the situation of women. I'm taking feminism really loosely to be a movement of philosophy which identifies and is committed to addressing women's systematic disadvantage. And similarly, I'm taking a loose understanding of gender itself. I don't have a strong account of what it means to be a woman, but I'm taking it as given that there are women and that their experiences and treatment generally differ from those of men. And this notion of womanhood includes cis women and trans women, and I'm not going to be attending specifically to trans or cisness in the talk. Before we begin properly, I want to note that I've done all my work, both the chapter and this presentation, on maternity leave for my first child. He's now 7 months old and I think currently being shown around the botanical gardens with my husband. The experience of new parenthood and occupying a quite obviously really gendered social role has naturally inflected my thinking on the topic that I've been writing, and I'll reflect a bit more on how it's done so near the end of the talk. Okay, so for Hadot, PWL requires a conversion which turns our life upside down, changing the life of the person who goes through it. So the philosophical life can't be lived piecemeal, but it's instead an entirely transformed mode of existence. So what might that imply about those who are able to take it up? I'd suggest that those who can undertake PWL wholeheartedly are genuinely not those who are engaged in socially reproductive labour. So Nancy Fraser understands social reproduction as the work of birthing and raising children, caring for friends and family members, maintaining households and broader communities, and sustaining connections more generally, And she points out that this work is required for society to function, for culture, economy, political organisation, and I might suggest philosophy. It's obviously no secret that the work of social reproduction is generally still done by women. So to take one example, the British Social Attitude Survey published in 2023 revealed that in the UK, 63% of women reported doing more than their fair share of housework, whereas only 22% of men reported the same. And responses also show that specific household tasks like cleaning and cooking were also largely undertaken by women. And I think this matters in this context because socially reproductive labour imposes a cost in time and capacity. The cost, which means that those responsible for it may not be able to transform their lives or commit themselves to a programme of spiritual exercises. We might wonder if these concerns are unique to philosophy's way of life, or if they pose a problem for philosophical endeavours in general. I think it's certainly the case that women have been historically less able to engage in philosophical discourse, but I think that this problem is far more acute in the case of PWL. So philosophy as a cognitive activity can, at least in theory, be taken up piecemeal. I can spend an hour here or there thinking through a problem or writing a paper, as I've been doing with this chapter and talk on maternity leave. But PWL is something that's intended to take up the subject's entire life and to have significant transformational effects on their self. It seems it needs to be rooted far more comprehensively in one's life than other forms of philosophy. And this doing so, it seems to have more preconditions to its practice. But does this matter? It's not intended that everyone should be philosophers. As Hadot writes in relation to ancient philosophy, philosophers are strange, a race apart. And to be a philosopher is to be estranged from the everyday world, to inhabit an unresolvable conflict between the life one should live and the customs and conventions of daily life. And so I don't want to suggest that something not being immediately available to everyone means that it's not worthwhile at all. It could be that the mode of life we call philosophy is harder for women to access, but that the solution lies in improving women's lot so that they're better able to do philosophy rather than discarding PWL. And I think there is a lot to be said for that point. And we might want to be aware when practicing or advocating PWL that some groups are systematically hindered from taking it up, but that perhaps should not stop us practicing or advocating it. As I tried to suggest above, though, I think there's a more serious issue at play. PWL, like culture, economy, or political organisation, seems to rely on socially reproductive labour being undertaken by others in some form, regardless of whether the others or the philosophers are women or not. And it seems to me that estranging oneself from the customs of the everyday kind of relies on someone somewhere doing the everyday things that the philosopher might spurn. So perhaps to put it more crudely, the effort to live and think according to the norm of wisdom, a movement of progression towards this transcendent state, to quote Hadot, may mean that someone else needs to be doing the dishes. So we may have a situation in which the very project of PWL may depend on gendered, and we might also have class-based and racialised labour done by others. Whereas philosophy as a cognitive activity might be engaged in piecemeal, an hour here or there, PWL as itself requires a deeper level of commitment. And this commitment seems to be reliant on others undertaking the rest of the work that keeps society going. So that first concern is, I think, theoretically applicable to any project that aims at complete individual transformation. I think you might want to apply it to a religious conversion as much as a philosophical one. To evaluate PWL properly, we need to address its specific content, which is what I'm aiming to do now. So as we all know, spiritual exercises are key to PWL, and they are practices which could be physical or discursive or intuitive, but which were all intended to effect a modification and a transformation in the subject who practice them. They're the things that we do to transform ourselves. Hadot discusses a wide range of spiritual exercises. I'm not going to cover them nearly all today, but one that is key to his whole project is attention to the present moment, as implied by the title of the book of interviews, "The Present Alone is Our Happiness." So the idea here is that we no longer project oneself into the future, but consider one's action in itself and for itself, become aware of the infinite value of the present moment. Now, the attention to the present may seem to be entirely gender neutral, But the very notion of temporalities has been challenged from feminist perspectives. So Rita Felsky identifies 4 forms of time that shape and circumscribe feminist thought, and argues that feminism cannot do without an orientation to the future. Andrea Doucet, on the other hand, pays particular attention to the temporal and spatial complexities of care responsibilities, arguing that they stretch across temporal and spatial boundaries. So with this in mind, we might start to wonder how sensitive attention to the present moment is to feminist needs, particularly with caregiving in mind as a feminist issue. We're going to elevate and attend to the present moment above all others might be seen here as a way of removing oneself from the temporalities and responsibilities of care. And as discussed already, caregiving with other socially reproductive labour is a highly gendered phenomenon. Another key exercise is the preparations for the difficulties of life, an exercise thought highly of by the Stoics. As Hadot presents them, these difficulties are somewhat unspecific and general. It seems that anyone may face difficulties and need to prepare for them. If we're more attentive to structures of marginalisation and oppression, however, we ought to be aware that difficulties are both unevenly distributed and often specific to our own social location. The challenges that a white woman may need to prepare herself for are not the same as the difficulties a black man is likely to face. Hadot's exercises as he presents them do not clearly account for this, nor I think for the network of power relations that these difficulties inevitably exist within. The preparations for large difficulties are linked to the training for death, which is itself connected to the attempt to liberate ourselves from a partial, passionate point of view, linked to the senses and the body, so as to rise to the universal normative viewpoint of thought, submitting ourselves to the demands of the logos and the norm of the good. And I'm going to discuss that universal viewpoint of thought in the next section. Here, however, I want to note that preparing for the difficulties of life and training for death both involve a kind of detachment. And I think this detachment from one's individual partial position in the world runs throughout those accounts of spiritual exercises. It seems, to my mind, inattentive both to relations of power and marginalisation, and also to relations of love, care and friendship. I think there is a point where he mentions friendship as being the spiritual exercise par excellence for the Epicureans, but that's not something that he really focuses on in the rest of his work. Some feminist philosophers, on the other hand, argue for the importance of care as a characteristically and essentially feminine, though uncomfortable with the essentially feminine phrasing there, approach to ethics. So Nell Noddings claims that women tend to define themselves in terms of caring and work their way through moral problems from the position of one caring. Carol Gilligan similarly and very famously notes that the stereotypical masculine stance is one which favours the separateness of the individual self over connection to others and leans more towards an autonomous life of work than towards the interdependence of love and care. I would suggest that for Hadot, spiritual exercises tend the philosopher far more towards independence than interdependence. Don't think we need to commit to any gender essentialism to make this point. Carol Gilligan takes pains to point out that the association between women and the ethic of care is not absolute, and the contrasts between male and female voices highlight a distinction between two modes of thought, rather than being intended as a generalisation about either sex. So what we see with PWL is a philosophical practice that generally does not engage with modes of thought or living that are broadly more associated with women. And this concern, I think, only intensifies as we come to the view from above, which I will address next. So, for Hadot, the entire system of spiritual exercises is aimed at bringing the philosopher to adopt the cosmic perspective in view from above. The aim is to detach oneself from one's egoistical point of view, to leave a unilateral view of things. Hadot refers to the point of view of Sirius. To adopt this point of view is the aim for the objectivity, the impartiality of the historian and the scholar. And it's this centrality of the view from above to PWL, which I think is most potentially alarming for the feminist. So Jean Grimshaw writes that one of the most fundamental aims of feminist philosophical work has been to deconstruct the claims of much masculinist philosophical theory to be universal or objective, and the sense of being able to adopt a God's eye view above the fray of things like social vocation and politics. And if this is true, then the centrality of the view from above to PWL seems intrinsically in tension with the aims of feminist philosophy. So in terms of the possibility of Haddo's cosmic perspective, one argument could be that it's in some way challenging for women to achieve, similarly to how PWL in general might be difficult to practice. But this particular line of thinking I'm not entirely comfortable with. It seems to confine women to the particular, to restrict them to the material world, deny them the possibilities of transcendence. So Simone de Beauvoir makes a similar point in The Second Sex, arguing that men doom woman to immanence, since her transcendence is to be overshadowed and forever transcended by another ego. If women are in fact denied the opportunity to take a view from above, this may not have any negative implications for PWL as such. Perhaps it should instead function as a call for change so that women are able to take this position. And I think there's a difference between this and the argument earlier that PWL as such might be difficult for women to engage in. PWL as a whole seems to require a social system in which socially reproductive labour is taken care of. Well, that's not obviously for me the case with the views from above. Of greater concern is whether it's possible for anyone to take the view from above, a problem that's not confined to women alone. The worry here is that there is simply no such thing as an objective mutual view that's aligned with universal reason. There are only specific perspectives. And again, going back to Jean Grimshaw, she notes that much feminist writing has aimed to show that this false universalism is in fact a kind of particularity, and that various feminists have argued that some kind of perspectivism must be an essential presupposition of feminist inquiry. The idea here, in other words, is that the universalism often presented is in fact a masculine perspective, and that there is always going to be some such perspective. And if this is so, then Haddo's push towards objectivity and impartiality may be seen as instead supposing a very specific and socially dominant perspective. So setting aside whether it's possible to take Haddo's view from above, I think there's an even more important question concerning its desirability. So Nancy Hartsock argues that women's lives make available a particular and privileged vantage point of male supremacy, a vantage point which can ground a powerful critique of the phallocentric institutions and ideology which constitute the capitalist form of patriarchy. And I think this is a really vital point. If women's lives offer up such a powerful vantage point, then abstracting oneself from that vantage point by adopting the view from above is to reject its unique possibilities. It's to relinquish an important tool of critique in favour of a possibly false universalism. And I think this is my key concern in relation to feminism and PWL, that it fundamentally overlooks some of the values of specific perspectives. And I want to relate this to my queries about feminist temporalities and the role of care. And by insisting on this kind of cosmic neutrality, PWL seems to omit a huge swathe of issues associated largely, although not exclusively, with women. So let's move on to questions of social and political injustice. We might wonder at first glance if PWL leaves the philosopher a little detached from social and political concerns. And Johnny Carlier asked Haddo whether there is a contradiction between the point of view of Sirius, which should necessarily move us away from humans, and the concern for community, which places us among humans. And it's worth considering this question in relation to feminist political issues specifically. Haddo is very clear, though, that the philosopher ought to combat injustice. And this is a thread which runs through his work on PWL. He repeatedly writes that one should not consent to everything that is a moral evil, such as injustice and the exploitation of humans by humans, but combat it. He comments too on specific injustices of his time. He refers to an experience wherein a furious woman hurled insults at me because I had dared to say that blacks were just as acceptable as whites. And in a particularly poignant comment for the reader of 2024, he refers to the tragedy of the Afghan women or the Palestinian children doomed to despair. And although these remarks seem promising in relation to feminist political struggle, I don't really get the impression that the philosopher Haddo could be an Afghan woman or a Palestinian child. The concern that the philosopher has for him is not self-interested, not the desire to liberate oneself and others in their situation from oppression. And I would suggest that the feminist woman, conversely, engages in feminist struggle not from a neutral perspective, from a general desire to tackle injustice, but from her own perspective and the perspective of solidarity with other women. Another issue I'd like to raise here is that Hadot advocates very explicitly an emotionally detached approach to fighting injustice, warning us against the risks of being swept along by political passions and hatreds. So for him, political action should be undertaken with a sense of inner peace, not from a place of anger. And this is in tension with the stance that many, although of course not all, feminists have taken. Audre Lorde, for instance, writes in relation to both racism and sexism that every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger, potentially useful against those oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought that anger into being. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy serving progress and change, a basic and radical alteration in all those assumptions underlining our lives. Whereas as Hadot presents it, PWL doesn't seem to make much room for appropriately felt feminist anger in the fight against oppression. So to summarise my critique of PWL, I've argued, or tried to argue, that it is systematically insensitive to women's perspectives and experiences. In the case of the view from above, this insensitivity might deny its practitioners a powerful tool of social critique by taking women out of their own standpoints. PWL, as Hadot presents it, may also devalue the role of care and deeply felt emotional engagement in the world, whether in the form of love or anger. And again, these are by no means intrinsically female things, but are undoubtedly more associated with women's lives and experiences. But this isn't the end of the discussion. While PWL, as Hadot presents it, is insensitive to gender in some troubling ways, I think it holds great potential to be reworked for feminist ends. My thinking in this area is a lot less fully developed than my critique, and so especially welcome any thoughts or feedback. A promising start might be the reversal and upheaval of our normal values offered by PWL. So Hadot writes that in every historical period there have been and there will be opposition between the customs and the conventions of everyday life and the mode of life of the philosophers who scandalise non-philosophers or make them laugh. Elsewhere, he refers to a complete reversal of our usual way of looking at things. I'd argue that feminism itself can be seen as such a reversal. Our usual way of looking at things is conditioned by a structurally sexist society, whereas feminism provides an alternative set of values. And by taking us completely outside of conventional value systems, at least in theory, PWL might serve a useful feminist function. We can get a bit more specific by returning again to the view from above. So while the universal perspective of pure reason might not be desirable for us, that doesn't mean that the partial, passionate point of view is necessarily any better for a feminist to situate herself in. Feminism, as with other political movements, I think entails that we situate ourselves as part of a larger struggle rather than being concerned with our own problems in isolation. What we might aim towards then is not the view from above understood as neutrality, but rather some kind of feminist standpoint. And I want to draw a link here with the feminist consciousness raising groups of the 1970s. These groups were intended to help women move from sharing personal experiences to an analysis of women's situation in society. In other words, they aim to lead women from a partial individual understanding of their problems to a conscious perspective that aligned them with women's experiences more generally. So we may want to think about a feminist PWL as a form of consciousness raising. So a feminist PWL aims to reverse our structurally sexist values and way of looking at things and replace them with feminist values and ways of looking. It aims to move us from an individualistic understanding of our problems and concerns to a conscious feminist understanding of those problems. And it would do so ideally through a set of feminist spiritual exercises. What might these exercises look like? So we start with the exercise of preparation for future difficulties. As Hadot presents it, this exercise seems to be gender neutral, and we might have neutral in respect to race, class, sexuality, etc. The difficulties are general, the ones that anyone might meet. For a feminist PWL, this exercise might instead be more targeted. A preparation to meet misogyny and structural sexism but not necessarily to accept it. Relating this back to the notion of consciousness raising, such an exercise could be aimed at situating one's own personal difficulties in a framework of structural disadvantage. I'm also interested in how anger might become part of feminist spiritual exercises. Just as I think there was a midway point between the view from above that Hadot advocates and the completely partial point of view that he wishes us to reject. There was a midway point between the removal of political passions and hatreds and a kind of unfocused, unhelpful experience of anger. What if there were spiritual exercises that helped us channel our anger appropriately and to use it as a powerful tool which Laura discusses? I also want to think about those crucial exercise of attention to the present moment and how it might be adapted with respect to feminist temporalities and temporalities of caring. So we might imagine an exercise in which the philosopher situates herself and her experiences within Rita Felskir's feminist temporalities of redemption, regression, repetition, and rupture. This need not be mutually exclusive with attention to the present moment, which may have its own value, but such an exercise could provide valuable alternative temporal framings for the feminist philosopher. As I noted above, my thoughts in this area are less developed, and I think there's a lot of work that could be done in the development of the feminist PWL. I very much welcome the comments on that after this talk. So finally, just a few comments on philosophy's way of life on maternity leave. As I said at the beginning, I've been working on this chapter and talk while on maternity leave for my first child. This has been the most intensely focused on caretaking I've ever been, and it's probably also the most gendered I've been by others around me and by the social position that I hold. I've been writing about PWL rather than in any way attempting seriously to practice it throughout this period, but I've inevitably reflected on it in relation to my experience as a parent. Caring for my child has taken up a huge amount of my time, naturally. In one sense, this is the time that's literally available to me in the day. I need to play with my daughter, feed her, change her nappies, settle her to sleep. When I'm doing these things, I'm simply not able to devote myself to a transformation of life that PWL requires. But at the same time, I'm also absorbed in the temporalities of caring that Andrea Doucet describes, kind of projecting myself forward and backwards in time as I reflect on and plan my daughter's care. I don't have the mental space to do what PWL demands of me. But perhaps most importantly of all, the experience of parenthood has been one of great physicality and particularity. Care deeply for this child, my child, to abstract myself from the feeling of great care and love for one small person feels not just challenging, but almost silly. But why would I want to do that when this particular attitude of care is the most valuable part of my life? All this said, it's also not hard to see how certain spiritual exercises, such as attention to the present moment and preparation for difficulties, can be beneficial during early parenthood. As much as I'm absorbed in the temporality of care, recentering my attention on the moment I'm in is vital to taking full pleasure in the time I spend with my child, rather than always being dragged forward into her future. Preparing myself for the difficulties of her sleep, her feeding, and all the other challenges that they might bring, and indeed trying to accept them, permits me to meet them with good cheer rather than being overwhelmed by them. I've only provided an outline today of some of the issues I see arising in the interaction between philosophy as a way of life and feminism. There's lots of other questions I would like to address and originally hoped to address in the chapter. For instance, the figure of the sage is central to Hadot's understanding of PWL. I'm interested in looking at how gendered or gender neutral this figure is. What happens if the sage is a woman? I'm interested in the possibilities of a feminist history of PWL, looking at where women have contributed to this tradition and how. So I've argued previously, for instance, that the early modern philosopher Mary Estelle might be seen to propose a kind of philosophy as a way of life designed for women. And finally, as mentioned, I'm not entirely happy with the suggestions I've made so far regarding feminist PWL. Feels if this needs more detailed fleshing out, if it's to be a serious option, particularly regarding feminist spiritual exercises. However, I've hopefully made some headway towards showing the concerns with PWL and feminism as things stand. If nothing else, I'd like the takeaway to be that any way of life needs to account for those things such as gender and race, which structure our lives as things stand. Without doing so, I think it will inevitably be quite badly lacking. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Simone. Clear and very insightful talk. Thank you very much. Please, questions. John first.
Yeah, hi Simone, good to see you again. That was fascinating, really interesting and thought-provoking. So I mean, one thought I had is this. So one of the blind spots that you've argued that Hadot has is that he doesn't really pay much attention to kind of structural power relations and that kind of thing. But there was another French guy writing in the 1970s who kind of was interested in that kind of stuff, someone that you know all about, right? And so given that, and Foucault's quite an interesting figure in the sense that he does talk about all of that. And then subsequently he talks about care of the self, and he draws on these ideas from Hadot. And there's not so much that he has to say connecting those two parts of his work. And so I just wonder whether you thought there were resources within Foucault where you could kind of join those two bits of his thought that might help to kind of solve some of the problems that you've raised.
Yes, I think so. And I think in my thesis, I kind of tried to do that. I think for this talk and the chapter, I was kind of almost trying to avoid Foucault. It felt like it brought so much more in than I was able to focus on. But I do think that I think Foucault kind of does draw some of that connection between the care of the self and the structural power relations. I also think there's been a lot of feminist work on the late Foucault. So I think another reason I didn't kind of go into it too much in this is that I felt like some of that's been covered in the feminist scholarship, where it feels as though Hadot's work I did look, as far as I can tell, there just haven't been much feminist attention to Hadot. So again, I wanted to kind of lean more on that. But I do think that Foucault does have some answers. Yeah.
Thank you. Eli?
Ditto, Pavel, really important and like central questions, and I think it's actually already come up in a conference at a way, and something I want to bring up, which is what would be if you have thoughts on a responsible feminist PWL historiography, because I think one of the problems you've seen has already come up is it's so much of this work has been done in the history of philosophy, right? So part of the problem is which traditions we select. Often these come from hyper-masculinist patriarchal cultures, and so those communities are going to have certain privileges on their spiritual exercises. So like one of the challenges we already talked about today is then like the selection process. Who do we include? Who is a philosopher? Maybe part of the problem is we don't have the right communities, figures, women, spaces involved to give us the resources on what spiritual exercises are helpful. So I'm wondering, again, like one of the thoughts is basically like, how should we be thinking about our historiographical work so we don't fall into some of the traps that are easy to fall into here?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Something I've always been really keen on is kind of expanding the kind of genres that we understand as philosophical, as well as maybe if we're looking for women in the history of philosophy and history of PWL, we're not just looking at women who've kind of written treatises, we're looking at women who've written letters, so we have evidence of living in a certain way. So I think part of that selection process is kind of opening the mind to what philosophy is. So I think I've always been interested in, when I've looked at early modern women philosophers, you get figures like Damaris Masham, who's understood as a philosopher because she wrote a couple of treatises, but I think the far more interesting material is actually in her letters with John Locke, and it's material that's not kind of philosophical arguments, it's stuff that's where she's wrangling with her position as a woman, as a housewife, and as a philosopher, and I think really kind of living through the process of trying to do philosophy and trying to navigate the different identities, and she's doing this in dialogue with Locke, which I find really interesting. So I think it is part of the process is kind of just attending to evidence of women philosophers' lives, not just writings, I don't also novel writing, but that's where a lot of my interest lies in historiography. I always find it a bit disappointing when you get kind of collections of texts of women philosophers and then their letters are just completely not included. Remember there was a kind of edition of Catherine Coburn's, another early modern philosopher's writings, none of her letters at all, and then kind of reading through her letters and like there's so much there of she was kind of giving to her niece kind of stoic guidance and instruction that felt like a really kind of example of her living a philosophical way of life that then gets erased from being philosophy by editorial decisions.
Yeah, it reminds me of that Nussbaum on just classical research in general, right? That we have also, where do we have access to those resources? Are they published? Can you get access to the letters? Do we even privilege them and put them in books? So, yeah.
And I've thoughts about how like editorial decisions that get made like influence what philosophy is or presuppose models of philosophy.
Michael first, and then Martha. Oh, sorry, Michael.
Thanks. Yes, thanks for a very interesting presentation. You put your finger on a lot of really problematic aspects, especially the idea of objectivity in itself, whether or not it's masculine, inherently masculine biased or not. Other aspects I found a little more difficulty understanding. For instance, you mentioned that it's hard to do spiritual exercises while doing the dishes, and I confess I don't see why one couldn't practice the view from or concentration on the present moment while doing the dishes. And more generally, on the same slide, at one point you question, you suggest that perhaps the death to one's individuality may impede the philosophy of care because they tend towards independence. On the contrary, I would have thought that the precondition for philosophy of care would be to eliminate one's egocentrism. And I think that that's when you look at some of the literature in the Italian movement, the Filosofia della Cura, thinking of the works of someone like Luigina Mortari, that's precisely why she thinks Heather was important, because this elimination of egocentrism, which is one of the goals of spiritual exercises, is a prerequisite for the philosophy of care. Or she thinks that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, with the doing the dishes remarks, at least partly a little glib, but I think so there's nothing necessarily intrinsic about the action of doing the dishes. I mean, I can't do a philosophical like a spiritual exercise while I'm doing it. I think what I want to get at is that there's something about the mental load of domestic labour and socially reproductive labour that does make the spiritual exercises more challenging. So it might not be necessary. Sure, I can do the dishes and I can meditate on the bad things that are going to happen. But if I'm doing the dishes and I also need to think who's going to do the dishes later and who's going to pick the kids up from school, and I need to plan. I need to plan my kid's birthday party as well, and I need to do this and that. I think it ties into what I was saying about Andrea Doucet and the kind of messy temporalities of care. It kind of spills over beyond the thing that I'm doing and into everything else. And I think that kind of messiness and sprawlingness of the socially reproductive attitude, I guess, is what makes it challenging. Yeah, the stuff around death of individuality and the philosophy of care is a bit that I was a bit less confident on myself. I'm not so familiar with the authors that you mentioned. I'd be interested in looking them up. I think where I was coming from was a sense of, and maybe of being a bit kind of messy with the connection to ethics of care specifically, was the idea of kind of my individual caring and my personal relations with specific people and my particular emotional engagement with particular people being valuable, and there being something I'm going to miss out or something's going to go wrong if I abstract myself from the care I have for my family or my child or whatever. I think maybe there's a bit more I need to do with the kind of text to back that up, but that's where I was coming from, is that there's something valuable about me and my caring, not just unselfish abstract caring.
Very completely helpful.
First Martha, then David.
Thank you so much, Simone. I think you raised really important issues and gave me a lot of food for thought. I have many thoughts, not all of them are organized, so sorry if I'm not so clear, but I felt the need to respond somehow as a woman speaking to another woman. It's a bit uncomfortable for me the way you speak about women, women's lives, women's perspectives, women's experiences. You are speaking about women as if to be a woman would correspond to a certain bios itself, a certain way of life. And I don't think it is, and my feminism almost prevents me from accepting that kind of stereotypical view, because we are both women and we obviously don't share the same perspective, because you're breastfeeding, you're raising a child, and I'm not a mother. So obviously our perspectives are different, and there's nothing wrong about that. So when you say that PWL is not attainable to women, you're already speaking of certain kind of women to which you are attaching a certain kind of roles, right? So that's a bit uncomfortable, I think. Then I wonder how much of what you said, and I understand, is specific of PWL and not of philosophy more generally conceived, and even of any kind of job, profession, occupation in general, because obviously a woman that is performing her social reproductive role, is it so? For her, it will always be more difficult than to a man to perform certain kinds of roles, certain kinds of jobs, even to dedicate themselves to reflection, contemplation, or other possible ways even of defining philosophy. So what is it? Are you specifically criticizing philosophy as a way of life, or in general the dedication of a woman to a life of philosophy or philosophical reflection? And to finish, if we take that one of the most important claims of philosophy as a way of life is that philosophy shouldn't be only about theories, doctrines, reflections, but about practice, that you should actually practice what you preach or what you believe. Wouldn't this be as perfect for feminist philosophy, right?
Yes, to go to your first point, I tried, maybe not adequately, to be quite clear that I wasn't aiming at any essentialist characterization of what women are like. I think necessarily for a chapter like this, I feel like I need to make some kind of characterization or distinction, kind of very broadly, between like each woman is different, but that doesn't mean that we can't say anything about things that are associated with women, or that women are tend to be more responsible for, and things that tend to be more associated with men. Like I have a friend who doesn't do the washing up, her husband does the washing up, but it doesn't mean that the role of like household labour doesn't disproportionately fall on women. I think it's generally a challenge for feminism and feminist discussions to work out where to draw the line between, like, too crude a characterization of men do this, women do this, men have these experiences, women have these experiences, and how far you want to kind of risk the complete individualization of course, every woman, every person has, of course, they have a unique experience. Like maybe I drew the line too far in one way, but I think you kind of have to draw it somewhere if you're going to have a meaningful discussion about gender in relation to PWL. I think in the case of something like socially reproductive labour, for instance, I tried to at least gesture towards the fact that it's not that all women do this or that only women do this, but that it is broadly gendered, it's broadly racialized, it's a class-based thing. There are these power structures in place that there are these differences in experiences that we can broadly associate with particular genders, etc. In terms of how much is specific to PWL, again, I certainly tried to be specific to PWL in what I was saying about spiritual exercises, abuse from above, the fight against injustice. I think the point about jobs is not quite the same because, except for very few jobs aren't usually requiring a complete transformation of ourselves. Some of them might, maybe if you become a priest or whatever, but most of the time I'm expected to kind of go to work at 9 o'clock and come home at 5 o'clock, and outside of that time maybe I have a disproportionate amount of socially reproductive labour. But philosophy as a way of life, as I understand it, it's this kind of complete personal transformation and conversion, which I think makes it not quite a unique challenge, because I think you get similar challenges perhaps with a religious mode of life, but a challenge that is not the same as the challenges of a job, or even just doing philosophy normally. And yeah, I agree that the focus on practice is really, it does tie in with feminism. I would have liked to have had more of a section on the idea of feminism as a philosophy as a way of life. I've not really had the space to develop that so much, because I was trying to work on these other two sections, and I didn't want it to be rushed, I think. But on the other hand, I also think there's so much more to PWL than just the notion of practice, so I didn't want to kind of dilute PWL and make them like anything can be PWL if you do it. So I tried to focus on the elements of both on here. But I do agree that there's harmony, and that's what I tried to engage with in the second half of the talk.
Just to make a quick comment. One of the things that I think is most important also in philosophy as a way of life is that it involves a process of self-transformation. So this transformation you associate to the conversion of which Hadou speaks is basically interior. It's yourself. It's not that you completely change your way of life in the sense of like what you do, your job, your occupation. I mean, in principle, you could be a Stoic mother or an Epicurean mother or a Nietzschean mother. You know, I mean, you could do all the practical things you need to do and be deeply changed inside. I think this conversion, the self-transformation that is at stake in philosophy as a way of life is basically maybe not only, but mainly interior.
Agreed, but I think as interior is some of that work of social reproduction and domestic labour, right? I think it's certainly not that it's impossible for women to do these things, but that as I said in kind of response to Michael's question, domestic labour isn't, and socially reproductive labour isn't just the chores, it's a whole set of interiority as well, that makes it more challenging. I mean, when we look at Mary Assel, for instance, she does propose exercises for women to do to practice at home, but like her primary proposal is that women transform their lives by withdrawing from the world of kind of the gendered world and inhabiting a kind of monastic space, and that's the kind of most effective way for them to be liberated from the misogynistic social structures that they're surrounded with. I mean, she makes it clear that it's very hard for women to transform themselves, given misogynistic structures that also kind of affect interiority. I think that's part of where that challenge comes in.
Thank you. David had a question from home.
Hello there. Sorry, the screen's just changed. It became philosophy and psychotherapy. I just want to make a quick suggestion, run out of time, I think Simone Webb would be very valuable, and how Iris Murdoch is engaged with the difference, and then Mary Midgley on PWL, just to complement your general, which in many ways I'm in much agreement with the limitations of interiority as one feature of PWL. maybe dialogue with you with email and things, but that was all that came to mind, especially when Mary Midgley said about Wittgenstein, he's clearly never fed a baby on the tit. So his picture of what we should do as philosophers is limited. So sorry to be brutally English about the value of what you might call a female orientation. And I also think an intention from that might be Lucia Garay and her criticisms of Levinas and Foucault, and the emphasis on breathing rather than speaking and listening would be another interesting PWL character to bring to your exposition. So just comments really.
Very much, really helpful. Yeah, a little bit of Simone and Murdoch and then which sounds potentially really useful.
Okay, last question before we take a break, Laura.
I will be very quick, thank you. I hope this question makes sense because I'm very, very tired right now. I know that you're not committed to any kind of essential notion of womanhood, which I think makes sense for this chapter because that's a huge conversation in itself. But it seems to me like you might be drawing on this notion of womanness or femaleness as a kind of social class with this social reproduction theory. And I liked that you mentioned Mary Spell, right? Because yes, she proposed a monastery, but that didn't work.
Yeah.
So she points out there are all of these things that are actually institutional obstacles to me as a woman having this kind of transformation. It's not so easy just to say we can transform no matter our situation. There are institutional obstacles to that. So I'm wondering if it would even help to have something in there like supporting this social reproduction theory. Like this is a kind of social class, and also it broadens PWL beyond just feminism, right? We can look at class issues, we can look at race issues, we can just say there are certain institutional barriers, and misogyny is one particular kind of barrier. But it's really, and you've done this in other work, right? Where it's really pushing us to look at PWL perhaps needing particular applications based on certain kinds of demographics if we consider things in terms of like social classes and reproduction of labor and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really helpful.
Okay, it's 3 minutes over 4 o'clock. It was a long session. We are going to take now 1 hour break. We are back in 1 hour at 17 hours here in Portugal. But first, before we take the break, I would like you to help me to thank really wonderful both Jennifer Baker and Simone Webb. Thank you.